So next up, Greg Wilson, VP of Field Strategy, joins us to talk about breaking out of silos to empower greater transparency, collaboration, and information sharing. So Greg, welcome. I can't wait to hear what you have to share with us today.
Thanks, Sarah. So I thought I'd start with a quick introduction. I think we actually have that, and start by talking a little bit about organizational silos and what those look like. And then we can migrate from there to some of the capability opportunities that exist if we can bring some of those silos together, and ultimately how we can go about doing that. So if we think about organizational silos, they came together for a reason. It enables some focus and specialization on very important tasks. And a few examples of those that we see frequently are things like generating demand forecasts, generating buys, dealing with replenishment and allocation, and then things like pricing and advertising, as well as managing the space in your selling locations, as well as constraints in distribution facilities. And then ultimately the inventory fulfillment activities that happen with replenishment and allocation, which influence transportation planning and ultimately labor planning. So all of these things are inclined to be in separate or at least groups of silos that they operate in. And like I said, this enables us to focus and get specialized and become real experts in those disciplines. But the problem is these even get more granular as you look across some of them, where you may have things like buying or inventory management that's different at the supplier level than it is at the distribution center level, and things like labor that are broken out from distribution center level and treated separately at store channels. So you get kind of sub-silos broken across those different things. And it creates some real challenges in managing how you operate as an entire entity. Now, if we simplify these into a few groups like this, we can look at store replenishment, inventory capacity, planning, space planning, workforce, and promotion and price. So what tends to happen is these things operate in a static world. So I'm making my promotions based on what I see now, and I'm making my store replenishment decisions based on the information that I have now. And that may impact the throughput of product through your supply network and put strains on both space and workforce. So if we think about this from an example perspective, every time one of these silos makes a change, it's having an impact on all the other silos, and they're having to react to it. So we have to go through this process of frequent realignment. If the velocity of product changes, if we look at an example of that, changes in volume, that's going to alter the flow of product. And an altered flow of product is going to impact the need for transportation. And that flow and change in transportation is going to impact the space and capacity that you have in fulfillment centers as well as brick and mortar locations. And all of these things will impact the labor that's necessary to support them. So each silo is attempting to respond to this. If we have flow that accelerates, then we have larger receipts that don't necessarily fit the capacity of these things, and we tend to have it all fall out, stressing labor. So what can we actually do to respond to this better? Do we throw more transportation at it to move this in an increased volume situation to move that product through? Do we allocate more labor to it? Do we allocate more space to the product because of this increase in demand? Well, if we look at those questions from more of a unified perspective, what we're actually looking at is a couple of different things. So what if the right answer isn't any of those three things of transportation, labor, or space, but it's changing the delivery cadence? Ultimately, what you really need to do is look at these things across the different silos. And you need to be able to consider all of the different dimensions. Now, this sounds all well and good and simple, but there are a number of operational challenges. So how do we get the information to each of these individual areas or disciplines of activity in a way that they can consume it, have it impact their activity, and do that on a timely basis, so we're optimizing across all of these things? Well, ultimately, you can really only accomplish this if you're supported by technology. Our perspective is an entirely unified environment is the appropriate way to go about addressing this. Now, those of you that are already RELEX customers are probably familiar with the way that we talk about our footprint and the things that we do. So it starts with a technology foundation that's able to take input from a variety of your host solutions, things like your enterprise resource planning systems, your POS systems, and various other supporting technologies that you have as an execution layer and operational layer. Now, we have a single point of integration where all of this data can come in, and we consume it and start by generating a demand forecast that can drive all of the activity around this. So what we want to do is have a forward-looking view driving as much activity as possible and all of the different silos at the same time. And we want that to be a common view. So we typically start, although we're not required to start, on the supply chain side. And what this allows us to do is bring together some of those distribution tiers that I talked about on the first slide into what we call a multi-echelon environment. So we're generating demand forecasts at brick and mortar locations as well as direct fulfillment center locations. And then we're deriving how much inventory is necessary to support that at each of those locations. And then the sum of the inventory for brick and mortar locations, for example, that are supported by an individual DC becomes the demand signal for that DC. And we can optimize through each network, each node in your supply network as a result of that. Then we're also considering different activities that influence that demand at the same time. Things like promotional forecasting, weather situations that you may have, cannibalization and halo. And we tie this all together into the demand forecast, but now an inventory plan, a projection of how inventory is going to be moving through the network. So the combination of that demand plan and the projection of inventory movement becomes a much more beneficial input and driver for some of the other silos. So if we start to think about some of the operational things like planning capacity and throughput through your network from your suppliers and managing the workforce that's necessary to process product, shelf product, and make it available for your consumers, having visibility to the forward flow of that product rather than just basing it on historical activity gives you a big advantage in understanding exactly how to address those needs. And similarly, on the space side of things, if we are driving our space plans with the visibility of the inventory that's going to move through there, then we understand what the maximum situation is that we're going to need for shelving product to support the demand and how that relates to different timeframes that need to be supported. And once we have all of these three dimensions in place, we can start looking across all of them to find the ideal way to manage situations where you may have peaks in activity, for example, for promotional activity or holidays, where we can flow the product and smooth the flow of that product so it's going through your network, and things that are less urgent to get to their end destination can be pushed outside of the high peak activity period to smooth the flow of product. And this makes managing the space as well as especially managing the workforce much more stable and predictable, so you're not having fluctuations that you're having to be very reactive to in those dimensions as well. And then because we're tying all of this together, we can look at things like what is the cadence that these products are moving at? If we're moving things once a week, should we be considering for some locations, maybe moving things more frequently for specific products, for example? And then we can also look at the different locations, for example, in brick and mortar retail locations, and say, what if we optimize the movement of inventory? So A, we're not putting things in back rooms, but we're putting them directly onto the shelf. And B, that ideally we're putting them onto shelves in one section of the store at a time. So when we have a receipt in a store location, processing and delivering that to one section of the store, as opposed to going to every aisle in a store, can save significant amounts of labor. But it's only when we can tie all of these things together that we can start to bring the silos together. So if we look at this from a philosophical perspective on two dimensions, I think all of us strive to be as autonomous as possible and automate much of this functionality as to the degree that it's feasible. But nothing's more obvious than the fact that change is a reality in retail, and we need to be able to adapt to that change. So if we look at things across these two dimensions and look at a progression of how we get to an end state that is ideal, we start with some automation, and most retailers have different levels of this that they've achieved already. For our customer base, we also have made great strides in unified planning, so planning across these different disciplines. And once we get that planning foundation in place, we can start to optimize. And this is where we're spending a lot of our effort right now, is optimizing across all of these different dimensions and disciplines. And ultimately, our goal is to build out this adaptive real-time platform that is autonomous and able to react to situations with a minimum of input from users. So we're focusing only those things that can benefit from the intuition of humans as far as what we serve up for people to interact with the solution on. And as much as possible beyond that is automated and reacting adaptively to the situation that it's seeing in retail. So I'll pause for a moment and we'll see if there are any questions after this brief conclusion. As I mentioned, change is continuous and relentless. I think everybody, especially through the pandemic, would agree with that as a fact of life in retail. And the pace of that change continues to accelerate. So we really have to unify this planning and execution across these silos if we expect to adapt to what's happening. And it's going to be very necessary in as competitive an environment as we're operating in today to actually get these things in place so we can remain as efficient as possible and therefore be as competitive as possible in the today's and the future retail environment. So I'll stop there, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that may be out there.
Thank you, Greg. I also agree with you. I think a lot of us have been through a lot of change over the last 18 months. And I think you also talked about collaboration. I mentioned this earlier. I also believe that collaboration is the future of supply chain and business as well. But before we move on, let's grab a question or two. We've got some from the audience. So the first one that I have for you is, how have you seen people successfully bridge silos?
That's a good question. Well, I think, you can go to some of the old psychiatry jokes. First thing is you have to want to change. So I think the most important thing is to make sure that the people who are responsible for these internal silos understand the potential value that they can get by bringing things together. I think, the thing that people start to, perk their ears up on is in some of the traditional disciplines of space management and workforce optimization, having the opportunity to plan those things with an accurate future forecast of not only the demand that's going to happen, but the movement of inventory, I think tends to be quite compelling to people. And, if you start acting and planning for a forward view across the organization with a unified perspective on what that's going to look like, the opportunities become much more apparent.
And endless. I talk about this all the time. I think supply chain needs to work with sales. They need to work with customer experience, customer success, marketing. There's so much innovation that's there if we could just bridge those silos and get everybody working together. So what type of organizations are inclined to have fewer silos?
That's a good question. I think the obvious answer is, smaller organizations tend to be a bit more responsive and adaptive, and you've got people wearing multiple hats. So there tend to be fewer silos that need to be bridged. Outside of that, when you get into these large organizations, it's almost necessary for the reasons I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation to get some specialization to do these things as well as possible. From there, it's really, finding the people who are the innovative thinkers who are really looking to constantly improve. And those people exist within every silo. So when we identify those folks, we tend to see them kind of encourage the overall organization to consider bridging these silos. And then there's also a point as you escalate in hierarchy structures where some of these silos fall under the same responsibility, and those people tend to be looking more strategically at how they can improve in the future. So those folks are inclined to have motivation, if you will, to look for opportunities that may come from bridging some of these silos as well.
And they could be really good champions for any organization, right? Or any team to
Absolutely.
be able to bridge that, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the projects that go the smoothest and have the best outcomes for us tend to be those with strong executive sponsorship.
Oh, great. I love that too. So are there changes to organizational structures required to get people to work across these groups? I mean, a lot of times we talk about silos and we talk about how we want everybody to collaborate. We want them to work together. But how do we do that?
Well, there are typically some opportunities to make some adjustments. I don't see it as a requirement. What we really try to do is bridge some of those gaps by enabling collaboration with the technology. So having a forecast that's driving all of this and everybody having visibility to it, and having a forward projection of inventory that everybody is looking into and operating to. Once we get them tied into that and bought into the fact that that's a benefit for them, then that starts to bring them together. So I think, while it's not necessary, I would also say it's not unusual once you see the opportunities and you gain some of the efficiencies to look for opportunities in changing the organizational structure and focus people on things where they may have been spending a lot of time, for example, collecting data. They can focus their time on more strategic things like, doing better analysis on promotional activity and those types of things, which provide additional incremental benefit as we get those silos pulled together.
And I would say, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, but be curious, right? Get up and walk over to that other department, have conversations with them, find out what it is on a day-to-day basis that they like to do. Maybe they have challenges that you and your department can help with.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And again, the technology helps with this because, you'll see things that are counterintuitive in the case of a forecast or the suggested inventory movement. And those are opportunities to collaborate, discuss, and understand why the solution is making those recommendations. So the people who may be responsible for generating that initial input can share their perspective on why this looks different than what you might have intuitively expected and how
Yes.
that benefits them.
Yeah, I think communication is key, especially when you're implementing a technology, because there are some things that can work for one department or one team, and some things that may not necessarily work for another. And so it's really, I think communication is super, super, super important for everybody to get together and make sure that it's going to work in reality.
Yeah, and that's true. And as you know, even within organizations, there are not really silos, but changes with different product types and product characteristics. So you've got slow-moving products that behave one way. You may have highly
Right.
volatile or highly seasonal products that act another way. For grocery and convenience retailers, you've got challenges with fresh products, and you may have things that are being influenced by external factors that have present real challenges as well. So each of these have nuances that benefit from everybody understanding how best to react to them.
And what about sales, right? When a product is put on sale, right, it affects all the other departments, including supply chain. And so I would assume that that's going to affect it as well.
Right. And sales, promotions, for example, there are different levels of those as well. So there are the proactive promotions where we're trying to drive demand, and those often send a shockwave through the whole supply network if there's not visibility to them. And one of the things
So
we
true.
do is we get that future visibility out there as early as possible so everything can plan for that. And then, there are also reactive promotions where something may not perform the way we had anticipated. And so you're making a price adjustment to try to clear that inventory. That's putting less stress on the supply network, but maybe putting more stress on store labor, for example.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Greg. I mean, it's incredible what an impact removing barriers can make to empower, there's that word again, more meaningful connections and supply chain performance. It looks like we're going to wrap just a little bit early. So this concludes day one of Retail Live.